Alastair Beaumont, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, expected the black-edged letter informing him of his wife's demise before the first snows fell. He had, after all, married her for the express purpose of her quiet, unobtrusive death. He had chosen the plainest, most sickly creature his mother's spiteful matchmaking had presented, a woman whose poverty and ill health were as notable as her lack of dowry, and he had sent her to the most remote, God-forsaken, and dilapidated of his properties, a granite tomb in the north known as Blackwood Manor, with the unspoken command to fade away. He did not expect, upon his own broken return months later, to find the tomb resurrected. He did not expect to find warmth and light spilling from its windows, the scent of baking bread and wood smoke chasing away the ghosts of mildew and rot. And he most certainly did not expect to find the dying woman not only very much alive, but standing in the heart of his family's library, her plain face magnificent in the firelight, ruling his reclaimed world with an ink-stained fist. He had sent a lamb to the slaughter, but a wolf had risen in her place, and he had just walked, wounded and weary, straight into her den. The solicitor's office smelled of dust and decaying promises. Sunlight, thin and pale as watered-down milk, struggled through the grimy panes of a tall window, illuminating a constellation of dancing motes in the air. It was a room designed to leech the hope from man, to remind him of contracts and consequences, of binding words on brittle paper that held more power than any sword or sentiment. For Alastair, Duke of Blackwood, the room was merely an extension of the gray emptiness that had taken up residence inside him long ago. He stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the London street below, on the meaningless scuttling of carriages and pedestrians. He was a tall man, built of long limbs and broad shoulders that spoke of a life of martial discipline. But a profound weariness had settled into his bones, rounding the sharp edges of his posture. The war had taken its toll, but it was the peace that was truly killing him, the endless, venomous politics of the court, the hollow duties of his title. This business here today was just another of those duties, a distasteful, yet necessary, transaction. Across the room, seated in stiff-backed chairs before the solicitor's enormous mahogany desk, was the other half of the transaction. An older woman, a distant cousin of some sort he believed, whose face was a pinched mask of desperation and cloying gratitude. And beside her, the girl, Ilara. He had not bothered to learn her surname. It was irrelevant. She was a vessel, a solution to a problem. His late mother, a woman whose capacity for inventive cruelty had been her only true talent, had stipulated in her will that he must marry within the year or forfeit a significant portion of the unentailed properties. It was her final, posthumous slap, a leash from beyond the grave. And so his mother's creature, her solicitor, had dredged up this candidate, the perfect instrument of his humiliation. He allowed his gaze to drift over her for a moment, a dispassionate assessment. The solicitor had described her as of a delicate constitution. It was a polite euphemism for sickly. She was pale, a bloodless, indoor pallor that made the faint lavender smudges beneath her eyes seem stark. The prompt from his mother's will have been a masterpiece of malice. The bride must be of gentle birth but utterly destitute, with no notable beauty or connections, a creature no man of his station would ever choose. Ilara fit the description perfectly. Her brown dress was clean but threadbare, its cut years out of fashion. She was not merely plain. There was a frustrating lack of any distinguishing feature about her face, save for a pair of eyes that were a startlingly clear, lucid gray. They were currently fixed on her own lap, where her hands were knotted together. The file had also noted she was pleasantly plump, another lie of gentility. She was not plump with the soft, well-fed curves of a society belle. She was soft with the puffiness of poor health, of a body struggling against itself. She was, in every conceivable way, a monument to his own entrapment. The solicitor, Mr. Abernathy, cleared his throat, the sound like stones rattling in a dry gourd. "Your Grace, if I may have your attention. The final documents are ready for your signature." Alastair turned from the window, his movement economical and devoid of any emotion. He walked to the desk, the scent of cold ash from the unlit hearth rising to meet him. He did not look at Alara or her aunt. He looked at the papers, at the black ink snaking across the page, binding him to this pale, quiet girl. A duchess. It was a farce. The terms are as we discussed, Abernathy continued, his voice unctuous. The marriage settlement provides a generous allowance for the duchess, to be administered by your estate. Upon your signature, her family's outstanding debts, as itemized here, he tapped a smaller stack of papers, will be considered settled in full. The aunt let out a small, trembling sigh of relief. It was the sound of a drowning woman finally finding a piece of driftwood. Alistair's jaw tightened. He picked up the pen. The nib scratched against the paper, a small, violent sound in the oppressive quiet. He signed his name, Alistair Beaumont, a signature that could command armies, sway parliaments, and now purchase a wife. He pushed the documents across the desk without a second glance. "It is done," he said, his voice low and resonant, yet utterly flat. "My carriage is waiting. We will depart for the north immediately." The aunt started to flutter. "Oh, your grace, so soon? Alara has not had time to prepare. Her things. She will require nothing," Alistair stated, the words like chips of ice. He finally looked at Alara, truly looked at her. Her gaze lifted from her lap to meet his, and for a single, arresting moment, he saw not fear or gratitude, but a flicker of something else. A spark of cold, defiant fire in those lucid gray eyes. It was the look of a trapped animal that had not yet given up the fight. Then it was gone, shuddered away, and she was merely a pale, plain girl again. "I am ready, your grace," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it held a surprising firmness, a lack of the tremor he had expected. He gave a curt nod. He had done his duty. He had acquired a duchess. Now, he would dispose of her. Not in any crude or illegal manner, of course. He was a man of precision, not passion. He would simply deposit her in the one place guaranteed to quietly, efficiently, and naturally finish the job that her poverty and ill health had already started. He would take her to Blackwood Manor, the rotting tooth in the jaw of his inheritance, and leave her there to the damp and the silence. He expected a black-edged letter by spring. It was the neatest, most clinical solution he could devise. The journey north was a study in miserable silence. For 3 days, the carriage rattled and swayed, a black, lacquered box hurtling through a landscape that grew progressively bleaker. The lush greens of the south bled out into the hard browns and grays of the north. The sky was a perpetual sheet of pewter, and a relentless, drizzling rain began to fall on the second day, a cold, persistent mist that seemed to seep through the very walls of the carriage. It coated the windows in a greasy film, obscuring the view of the desolate moors and craggy hills that rolled past. Inside, the air was thick with the unsaid. Alistair sat opposite her, a formidable statue of indifference. He had not spoken more than a handful of words to her since leaving London. He had a book open on his lap, a dense volume on Roman military strategy, but he did not read it. His eyes were fixed on the rain-streaked glass, his thoughts 1,000 miles away, wrestling with political betrayals and the ghosts of fallen comrades. The woman across from him was a minor annoyance, a piece of living luggage he was transporting. He was aware of her in the way one is aware of a ticking clock in an empty room, a subtle, persistent presence. He could hear the soft, shallow rasp of her breathing, punctuated by a recurring, stifled cough that she tried to hide behind a gloved hand. The sound grated on his nerves, a constant reminder of the frailty he had purchased. Alara sat perfectly still, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She felt his disregard like a physical weight, a pressure in the air. He had not offered her a rug, though the damp chill was palpable. He had not asked if she was comfortable. He had not acknowledged her existence beyond the initial command to enter the carriage. She was a parcel, and he was the courier. Fine. She had been treated as a commodity for so long by her own family that this cold, honest dismissal was almost a relief. There were no false smiles here, no cloying pleasantries to navigate. There was only the truth of their arrangement, stark and cold as the landscape outside. She watched him from beneath her lashes. He was handsome, she supposed, in a severe, unforgiving way. His face was all sharp angles and hard planes, a face carved from granite and shadowed by exhaustion. There were lines of strain around his eyes and a grim set to his mouth that suggested he had forgotten how to smile, if he had ever known. He looked like a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness and found it reflected in his own soul. He was a duke, a creature of immense power and privilege, yet he looked more imprisoned than she felt. She was a survivor, accustomed to the cage of circumstance. He, she sensed, was rattling the bars of a cage of his own making. The smell of the carriage was a suffocating blend of damp wool, old leather, and the faint, metallic scent of the rain. With every mile northward, the chill deepened. It crept into her bones, aggravating the ache in her lungs. She pressed her lips together, fighting back another cough. She would not show weakness. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing the frail, dying creature he had so clearly paid for. Pride was the only currency she had left, and she would spend it carefully. On the evening of the third day, the carriage lurched off the main road and onto a rutted track that seemed to be actively trying to shake it apart. The trees grew thicker here, ancient and gnarled, their branches clawing at the carriage roof. The rain intensified, drumming a frantic, angry rhythm. Finally, through the gloom and the deluge, she saw it. Blackwood Manor. It was not a house. It was a jagged silhouette against the bruised twilight sky, a place where hope had come to die. It rose from the moorland like a great, stone beast, its granite walls stained black with centuries of rain and lichen. Many of the windows were dark, gaping mouths, some boarded over like blinded eyes. The gardens were a riot of weeds and thorns, strangling the skeletal remains of rose bushes. A single, flickering light shone from a lower window, a lonely, defiant spark against the overwhelming darkness. The air itself seemed to change as they approached, growing heavy with the smell of wet earth, stone, and a deep, pervasive decay. It smelled like an open grave. The carriage shuddered to a halt before a massive, iron-studded oak door. For a moment, nothing happened. The only sounds were the drumming rain and the heaving breath of the horses. Then, a footman, his face a mask of grim reluctance, opened the door. The cold, damp air rushed in, carrying the scent of mildew and wet stone. Alistair finally moved. He closed his book and rose, his tall frame filling the small space. He did not offer her a hand. He did not even look at her. "We have arrived," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection. He stepped out into the rain, his boots sinking into the muddy gravel of the drive. Alara gathered her resolve and followed him. The moment she stepped out of the carriage, the wind and rain hit her like a physical blow, plastering her thin dress to her skin and stealing the breath from her lungs. She stumbled on the uneven ground, her worn-out shoes immediately soaked. She looked up at the house, a monstrous, looming presence that seemed to stare down at her with cold malevolence. Alistair was already at the door, which had creaked open to reveal a sliver of dim, yellow light. He spoke to someone inside, his words brief and clipped. Then he turned back, his form a tall, dark cutout against the meager light. He looked at her, standing there in the mud and the rain, a small, sodden figure against the vast, oppressive backdrop of her new home. "This is your domain now, Duchess," he said, and the title was a deliberate, cutting mockery. "The staff are yours to command, such as they are. The accounts are in arrears. The roof leaks. I'm told the West Wing is structurally unsound." He recited the litany of failures with a kind of detached satisfaction. He was handing her a corpse and daring her to find a flicker of life in it. "Do with it what you will," he continued, his voice dropping lower, colder. "I expect I shall not be returning for some time." He paused, and for a fleeting second, she thought he might say something more, something human. He did not. He simply gave her one last, dismissive look, a look that said he was consigning her to the gloom, to the damp, to the inevitable. It was a look that said, "Die quietly." Then he turned, without another word, and strode back to the carriage. He did not look back. He did not hesitate. The footman slammed the carriage door, the driver cracked his whip, and the heavy vehicle churned away, its wheels spraying mud. Alara stood alone in the driving rain, watching the carriage's twin lanterns recede into the darkness until they were swallowed whole. The sound of the horses faded, leaving only the hiss of the rain and the mournful cry of the wind. She was left in the mud, facing a hostile house, with the weight of a ducal coronet and a death sentence settling upon her shoulders. A figure emerged from the doorway, a severe, bony woman in a black dress, her face set in a permanent expression of disapproval. This, Alara surmised, must be the housekeeper. "You had best come in, my lady," the woman said, her voice as brittle as dead leaves. "Before you catch your death." The words were not an invitation. They were a prophecy. The housekeeper, a woman whose name was apparently Mrs. Gable, led her into a cavernous entry hall. The air inside was even colder than the air outside, and it carried the thick, cloying stench of mildew and something else, something like old, wet paper and forgotten things. A single, sputtering oil lamp on a warped side table did little to dispel the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows that made the hall seem alive with monstrous shapes. Water dripped with a slow, maddening rhythm from a dark stain on the ceiling high above, plopping into a tarnished brass bucket set on the flagstones. The sound echoed in the vast, dead space. It was the house's weak, failing heartbeat. "His Grace said to show you to the Crimson Room," Mrs. Gable stated, her lips barely moving. The name was a cruel joke. The room, when they reached it at the end of a long, drafty corridor, was anything but crimson. It was a symphony of gray and brown. Heavy, moth-eaten damask curtains, the color of dried blood, blocked what little light might have existed outside. The furniture was shrouded in dusty white cloths, making the pieces look like a gathering of ghosts. The air was frigid and utterly still, so cold that Alara could see her own breath plume in front of her. A vast, canopied bed dominated the room, its hangings damp to the touch. There was no fire laid in the grate. "Your trunk will be brought up," Mrs. Gable said, her tone implying it was a great inconvenience. "Cook will send up a tray. If you require anything else, pull the bell." She gestured to a frayed rope near the bed before turning to leave, her task complete. She had delivered the lamb to its pen. For a week, Alara existed in that room. It was a prison cell disguised as a bedchamber. The dampness was a living entity clinging to her clothes, her hair, the very sheets on the bed. A fire was lit each morning by a sullen housemaid who seemed resentful of the effort, but it was a small, sulking thing that produced more smoke than heat, and it died out by midday, leaving the room to its tomb-like chill. The food that appeared on the trays was lukewarm and tasteless, thin gruel, stale bread, watery broth. It was sustenance meant for an invalid, food that offered no comfort, no strength. Her cough, which had been a quiet, manageable thing, worsened. It became a deep, rattling presence in her chest, waking her in the night, leaving her breathless and weak. She spent her days in the enormous cold bed, the damp sheets clinging to her skin, listening to the drip, drip, drip of water in the hall and the whistle of the wind through the ill-fitting window frames. The house was actively trying to kill her. The staff, with their indifferent service and averted eyes, were its accomplices. They moved around her with the quiet efficiency of undertakers, waiting for her to fail. They had seen the Duke's dismissal, and they had taken their cue. She was a temporary problem, a ghost already in residence. She felt her will beginning to fray. The defiance that had carried her through the solicitor's office and the silent carriage ride was being eroded by the relentless cold and the profound, crushing loneliness. Despair was a cold, heavy fog, seeping into the room, more insidious than the damp. She would lie there, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, stains that looked like maps of countries she would never see. She thought of the Duke's face as he had left her, the finality in his eyes. This was his plan, a quiet, natural, perfectly legal extermination. She was to be a footnote in his life, the sickly first duchess who had expired at his remote northern estate. On the 8th day, something shifted. She woke from a fitful, feverish sleep, her body aching and her chest on fire with each ragged breath. The morning was dark, the rain still lashing against the glass. The fire in the grate was nothing but a pile of cold, gray ash. The room was an icebox, and in that moment, lying in the frigid dark, a wave of fury, white-hot and clarifying, washed through her. It was a rage so pure and potent it burned away the fog of despair. She would not die here. She would not die in this cold, damp bed, a victim of neglect and a man's casual cruelty. She had survived her grasping relatives. She had survived poverty. She had survived the humiliation of being sold like livestock. She would be damned if she let a leaky roof and apathetic servants be the end of her. She threw back the heavy, damp covers. Her feet hit the icy floorboards with a shock that jolted through her entire body. Shivering, racked by a series of deep, painful coughs, she found her worn dressing gown and pulled it on. She was no longer a dying woman. She was a living one, and she was the Duchess of Blackwood. It was a title he had mocked her with, but it was a title nonetheless. And a title, she decided, was a weapon. She strode to the bell pull and yanked it with a force that threatened to tear it from the wall. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of rebellion. Minutes passed. No one came. Of course. They expected her to be too weak to ring, or for her summons to be a feeble, pleading tinkle. With a snarl of frustration, she wrenched open the door to her room and walked out into the corridor. Her bare feet recoiled from the cold flagstones, but she ignored it. She followed the hallway to the top of the grand, sweeping staircase that led down into the echoing gloom of the main hall. Mrs. Gable. Her voice, though roughened by her cough, cracked through the silence like a whip. It was shockingly loud in the dead house. She saw a flicker of movement below, the housekeeper, emerging from a doorway, her face a mask of startled indignation. "My lady," the woman began, her tone laced with disapproval. "You should be in your bed." "I will be in my bed when I am dead, Mrs. Gable," Elara called down, her voice gaining strength from her own audacity. "And I am not dead yet. You will come up here. Now." There was a moment of stunned silence. The drip from the ceiling seemed to hold its breath. Then, with visible reluctance, the housekeeper began her slow ascent. Elara waited at the top of the stairs, a small, fierce figure in a threadbare dressing gown, her pale face flushed with fever and fury. She did not feel frail. She felt magnificent. When Mrs. Gable reached the top, her face pinched with resentment, Elara did not give her a chance to speak. "You will move my things out of that tomb," she commanded, pointing a trembling finger back toward the crimson room. "You will move them into the smallest, driest servant's room you can find above the kitchens. I require warmth, and I require it now." The housekeeper's jaw dropped. "A servant's room? My lady, that is not. It is what I have commanded." Elara cut her off, her gray eyes flashing. "Furthermore, you will instruct the cook to keep the kitchen stove burning day and night. And you will have a proper fire, a large fire, built in the main hall. I want to see this place lit. I want to feel warmth in it." She took a ragged breath, the effort costing her, but she pushed on. "And one more thing, Mrs. Gable. You will bring me the estate ledgers. All of them. And a pot of hot, strong tea. To the main hall. Immediately." Mrs. Gable stared at her, as if she had sprouted a second head. For a heartbeat, Elara saw a flicker of rebellion in the older woman's eyes, a desire to refuse, to put this upstart back in her place. But Elara held her gaze, pouring every last ounce of her will into it. She was the Duchess. She was the mistress of this house, and she was done being a victim. The housekeeper's gaze faltered first. A flicker of something, was it fear, respect, crossed her face. She gave a stiff, jerky curtsy. "As you wish, my lady," she said, the words clipped, and she turned and descended the stairs, her steps noticeably quicker than they had been on the way up. Alara stood there for a moment longer, swaying with exhaustion and the adrenaline of her confrontation. A violent coughing fit seized her, doubling her over, but when it passed, she straightened up. She had won the first skirmish. The war for Blackwood had just begun. The takeover of Blackwood Manor was not a grand campaign. It was a series of small, practical, hard-won battles. Alara, installed in a tiny, Spartan room above the kitchens, found that the simple, radiant heat from the constantly burning stove below was a more effective medicine than any doctor's tonic. The dry warmth soothed the inflammation in her lungs, quieting her cough and allowing her to breathe without pain for the first time in weeks. It was a small victory, but it was the foundation for everything that followed. The estate ledgers arrived, a half-dozen enormous, leather-bound volumes smelling of mildew and neglect. They were delivered to a table she had ordered placed near the newly roaring fire in the main hall. Mrs. Gable had, grudgingly, followed her orders. The fire was a magnificent, defiant beast, consuming logs with a hungry crackle and casting a warm, golden glow across the grim flagstones. It pushed back the shadows, and for the first time, made the cavernous space feel less like a tomb and more like a hearth. For 2 days, Alara did nothing but sit by that fire, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, drinking endless cups of hot tea and devouring the ledgers. The story they told was one of slow, creeping death. Years of mismanagement, of funds diverted, of bills unpaid, of rents uncollected. The Duke, her absent husband, had clearly not set foot here in a decade or more, and his appointed steward had been either incompetent or corrupt, or both. The estate was bleeding money, its resources being sucked dry while the house itself crumbled. But within the columns of spidery ink, amidst the tales of decay, Alara found something else, potential. The estate was vast. There were tenant farms, timber rights, grazing lands, even a small disused quarry. These were assets, dormant but not dead. Her mind, sharp and practical, honed by years of having to make a shilling do the work of a pound, began to calculate. She was no aristocrat, accustomed to effortless wealth. She was the daughter of a bankrupt merchant, and she understood the brutal, simple arithmetic of survival. Her first major act was to declare war on the house itself. It was too large, a wounded leviathan impossible to keep warm or dry. With the reluctant help of the estate's groundsman, a taciturn, wiry man named Finch whose hands were as gnarled as the roots of an old oak, she began a strategic retreat. They went through the house, room by room, and decided what was salvageable and what was not. The entire west wing, with its sagging roof and crumbling walls, was declared lost. They boarded up the doors leading to it, sealing it off like a gangrenous limb. Dozens of other staterooms, filled with rotting furniture and peeling portraits of glowering Beaumont ancestors, were similarly closed. She consolidated. They would live in the core of the house. The kitchens, the main hall, the library, which she discovered was blessedly dry due to its southern exposure, and a small suite of rooms directly above it. Everything else was shut away. This simple act had an immediate effect. With fewer rooms to heat, the fires burned hotter, the drafts lessened. The house began to feel less like a vast, echoing mausoleum and more like a fortress, battening down its hatches against the winter. Next, she turned to the finances. She summoned Mrs. Gable, not as a duchess to a servant, but as a general to a subordinate. She laid the ledgers open on the library table. The wine cellar is stocked with 200 bottles of French brandy, Alara said, her finger tracing a line in the book. We have no money for roof tiles, but we have brandy. This is madness. Mrs. Gable looked aghast. His Grace's father laid down that cellar. His Grace's father is dead, Alara stated flatly, and his son is paying to house his ghost while the roof caves in. We will sell it, all of it. And so she did. Finch knew a merchant in the nearest town, a man with a taste for fine spirits. A deal was struck. A wagon loaded with dusty bottles trundled away from Blackwood, and a few days later, Finch returned with a purse heavy with coin. It felt like a miracle. Alara used the money not for silks or fripperies, but for slate tiles, for glass to repair the windows, for sacks of flour and sides of bacon. She was provisioning an army for a long siege. This act shifted something in the house. The staff, who had initially viewed her with suspicion and contempt, began to watch her with a new, grudging respect. They saw the new slates going up on the kitchen roof, installed by Finch and a boy from the village. They smelled the scent of baking bread, made from the flour she had bought, filling the halls for the first time in years. They ate hot, savory stew instead of thin, watery gruel. Their new duchess was not a fragile lady waiting to die. She was a quartermaster, a pragmatist. They slowly began to realize, one of them, a survivor. Her relationship with Finch became the cornerstone of her new regime. He was a man of the earth, his knowledge of the estate profound and intimate. He had served the Beaumonts his entire life, and his loyalty was to the land, not to the absentee lord in London. In Alara, he recognized a similar spirit. He saw that she cared for the place not as a possession, but as a living thing that needed tending. Together, they walked the grounds. He showed her which fields were fallow, which tenants were struggling, which tracts of timber were ready for harvest. She listened, absorbed everything, her sharp mind processing the information. She made decisions that were radical in their common sense. She forgave the back rent of a tenant farmer whose roof had collapsed, on the condition that his sons help with repairs of the manor. She leased a parcel of unused grazing land to a sheep farmer from the next valley over, the contract written out in her own neat, clear hand. She started a kitchen garden in a sheltered, south-facing courtyard that had been choked with weeds. She worked alongside Finch and two newly hired village girls, her hands, once soft and pale, becoming chapped and calloused. They turned the soil, planted winter greens, and repaired the crumbling walls of the old greenhouse. She discovered a forgotten herb garden near the kitchens, a tangle of woody stems that, with ruthless pruning, revealed the resilient life of rosemary, thyme, and sage. Soon, the kitchen was filled with the hearty, aromatic scents of the earth. The house began to transform. The pervasive smell of decay was slowly being overwritten by new smells. The sharp tang of wood smoke, the earthy scent of drying herbs, the clean fragrance of beeswax polish on the library's oak paneling, the comforting aroma of fresh bread. The dripping in the main hall stopped. Light from clean windows now reached into corners that had not seen the sun in a generation. Blackwood was still a scarred and battered place, but it was no longer dying. It was breathing again. And Alara, too, was transformed. The puffiness of ill health was replaced by a sturdy strength, earned through physical labor. The pallor of her skin was warmed by the wind and the firelight. The haunted, exhausted look in her eyes was replaced by the sharp, focused gaze of a commander. She still had the plain face and the simple brown hair, but they were now animated by a fierce and undeniable vitality. She had been sent to this ruin to be its final victim. Instead, she had become its unlikely savior. She had stopped being the Duke of Blackwood's disposable wife and had become the Duchess of Blackwood Manor in truth, the ruler of a small, resilient kingdom she had built with her own two hands. Alistair returned in the dead of winter, on a night when the world was silent and white. He came not in a grand carriage, but on the back of a single, exhausted horse, a lone rider cloaked in snow and shadows. He had fled London as a defeated man. The political battles he had been fighting, the intricate wars of whispers and knives in the halls of power, had finally broken him. A carefully laid plan had been betrayed, a trusted ally revealed as a serpent, and the entire edifice of his work had crumbled into dust and recrimination. He felt hollowed out, scoured clean of everything but a bone-deep weariness. He wanted only silence. He wanted the grave-like peace of the northern estate he had half forgotten. In the back of his mind, a cold, clinical thought surfaced. He would have to deal with the matter of his late wife. He assumed, with the detached certainty of a man arranging his affairs, that she would be dead. He pictured a small, neat headstone in the local churchyard, a problem solved by time and weather. He craved the absolute, uncomplicated quiet of the tomb he had sent her to. The first sign that something was wrong, or rather, not as he expected, was the gate. The great, wrought iron gates to the estate had, for as long as he could remember, been rusted half open, one of them sagging on a broken hinge. Now they stood straight and tall, the iron black and solid against the snow. They were closed, but not locked. He dismounted, his boots crunching in the thick blanket of white, and swung one of them open. It moved smoothly, silently, on a well-oiled hinge. The small, simple fact of it was so jarring that he stood still for a moment, frowning into the darkness. He remounted and urged his horse up the long drive. The avenue of ancient oaks, which should have been a tangled mess of broken and hanging branches, had been pruned. Their skeletal limbs were stark and clean against the snow-laden sky. It was orderly. The sight filled him with a strange and unwelcome sense of unease. This was not the picture of decay he held in his memory. Then he rounded the final curve, and the house came into view, and he stopped breathing. It was not the dark, gaping skull he had been anticipating. Light, warm, golden, impossible light, poured from a dozen windows on the ground floor and several on the floor above. Smoke, thick and white with the promise of heat, plumed from not one, but 3 separate chimneys, rising in straight, unwavering columns into the frigid, still air. The house was not a corpse. It was alive. It sat in the heart of the snow-covered landscape like a great, sleeping beast, its windows like watchful, glowing eyes. Alistair felt a surge of something he could not name. It was not anger, not yet. It was a profound, disorienting shock, the feeling of a man who finds the laws of physics have suddenly been suspended. He nudged his horse forward, his mind struggling to reconcile the vibrant, living house before him with the ruin he had abandoned. As he drew closer, a scent reached him on the cold air. Not the familiar stench of rot and mildew. It was the smell of wood smoke and, impossibly, of roasting meat and rosemary. He dismounted by the main door, his body stiff with cold and confusion. Before he could even reach for the handle, the door swung open. A man he vaguely recognized as the groundsman, Finch, stood there, holding a lantern. The man's face was weathered, but his eyes were clear, and he held himself with a new kind of confidence. He showed no deference. He showed no surprise. "Your Grace," Finch said, his tone perfectly level. "We were not expecting you." "Clearly," Alistair said, his own voice sounding rough in his ears. He stepped past the man into the main hall. The warmth hit him like a physical blow. A colossal fire raged in the great hearth, its flames leaping and dancing, casting a dynamic, living light over the stone walls. The air was warm and dry, filled with the scent of burning oak and beeswax. The brass bucket that had once collected the perpetual drip from the ceiling was gone. The ceiling above it was clean and unstained. The hall was not filled with shrouded, ghostly furniture, but was orderly, clean, the flagstones swept, a long table set near the fire. He felt as though he had walked into the wrong house, the wrong life. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice sharp. He did not need to say her name. Finch's expression did not change. "The Duchess is in the library." He gestured down the corridor. "She is finishing the quarterly accounts." The quarterly accounts. The words were so mundane, so absurdly practical, that Alistair could only stare. He had left a woman to die, and she was doing the bookkeeping. Without another word, he strode down the hall, his snow-crusted boots loud on the clean stone. He threw open the library doors. The scene that met his eyes burned itself into his memory. The room was an oasis of warmth and order. The shelves were dusted, the books arranged, the oak paneling gleaming in the light of a dozen candles and another healthy fire in the hearth. And at the center of it all, seated at the massive desk that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that, was Alara. She was not the pale, puffy, sickly creature he remembered. The woman at the desk was formidable. Her brown hair was pinned up in a simple, practical knot, but strands had escaped to curl around a face that was no longer plain, but alive with concentration and intelligence. Her cheeks had a healthy color, and the frail softness of her body had been replaced by a sturdy, capable strength that was visible in the line of her shoulders and the way she leaned over her work. She wore a simple, dark-wool dress, its cuffs smudged with ink. There was even a faint streak of dirt on her cheek, as if she had come straight from some task in the garden. She looked up as he entered, her lucid gray eyes, clear and cold as a winter sky, meeting his. There was no fear in them. There was no surprise. There was only a faint, weary annoyance, as if he were an interruption she had been anticipating. He stood there, dripping melted snow on her clean floor, the silence stretching between them. He, the master of the house, the Duke of Blackwood, felt like an intruder, a ghost. He searched for something to say, something to reclaim his authority, to make sense of the impossible reality before him. The only words that came out were blunt, accusatory. "You're alive." She did not even have the grace to look startled. She carefully blotted the line of figures she had been writing in the ledger before her. Only then did she lean back in his chair, her gaze unwavering. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she said, her voice laced with a dry, cutting irony that sliced through his confusion. "I find it happens to be a persistent condition." She surveyed him, from his snow-dusted hair to his mud-caked boots, a slow, deliberate assessment that was unervingly like the one he had given her in the solicitor's office. But her look was not one of dismissal. It was one of appraisal. He was a problem that had just walked through her door. "Do you require something, Your Grace?" she asked, her tone crisp and businesslike. "Or are you merely here to loom and drip on the floor?" The staff just waxed it. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it stole his breath. He had come home seeking a tomb, and he had found a queen on her throne, and she had just, in no uncertain terms, told him to wipe his feet. The power dynamic he had established so brutally on the day of her arrival had not just been challenged. It had been utterly and completely inverted. He was an outsider in a world she had built from the ashes of his neglect. He was in her house now. The days that followed were a silent, undeclared war. Alistair found himself a stranger in his own home, a phantom drifting through a world that had been entirely remade without his knowledge or consent. The house ran on a rhythm he did not understand, a schedule of practical tasks and quiet efficiencies that revolved entirely around the woman in the library. He was the Duke, the owner of every stone and timber, yet his authority was a hollow thing. The staff, from Mrs. Gable down to the youngest housemaid, treated him with a detached, formal politeness, but it was to Alara they went for orders. Their loyalty, he saw with a clarity that was both infuriating and grudgingly impressive, had been completely and utterly transferred. He would come down in the morning to find her already at the library desk, a mug of steaming tea beside her, deep in conversation with Finch about crop rotation or with the cook about the week's menus. She would nod to him, a cool, professional acknowledgement, before returning to her work. He was a guest, an observer, a disruption to the smooth functioning of the machine she had built. His presence was an awkward fact that everyone, himself included, seemed unsure how to handle. He tried, once, to assert himself. He found her in the main hall, directing 2 workmen who were repairing the plaster on the far wall. "I did not give permission for these repairs," he stated, his voice colder than he intended. Alara turned to him, one eyebrow slightly raised. She held a small ledger in her hands. "No, you did not," she agreed calmly. "I did. The wall was crumbling from water damage. I am paying for it with the income from the east pastures, which I leased to Farmer McLeod 3 months ago. Would you like to see the contract?" She held the ledger out to him. It was a direct challenge. He was being confronted with facts, with numbers, with the undeniable evidence of her competence. To argue would be to argue against the preservation of his own property. To pull rank would make him look like a fool, a petty tyrant raging against sensible governance. He stared at the book, then at her calm, unreadable face. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, the sound of the workmen's trowels scraping behind him a testament to his defeat. He began to wander the estate, trying to map the scale of her changes. He saw the repaired roofs, the cleared ditches, the healthy stock in the fields. He saw the burgeoning kitchen garden, now covered in protective cloches against the frost. He saw the neat stacks of firewood, the organized barns, the general air of purpose and thrift. She had not merely stopped the decay. She had reversed it. She had taken his ruin and was painstakingly, pragmatically, turning it into a thriving enterprise. He found himself watching her. He would stand in the shadows of the library doorway, watching her brow furrow in concentration as she reconciled an account. He would see her through the window, talking to a tenant's wife, her head inclined as she listened, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. He saw the way Finch's grim face would soften when he spoke to her, the way Mrs. Gable, the dragon of a housekeeper, now brought her tea without being asked. He had brought her here to be erased, to vanish into the damp and the gloom. But she had refused. She had put down roots in this barren soil and had not only survived but flourished. The plain, sickly woman from the solicitor's office was gone. In her place was this formidable, tireless, infuriatingly capable stranger. He did not know what to do with her. He did not know what to do with the grudging, unwilling spark of respect that had begun to smolder within him. He was a duke, a warrior, a politician. He knew how to fight enemies, how to command men, how to navigate the treacherous currents of power. He had no idea how to deal with a wife who was quietly and efficiently rendering him obsolete. The unifying threat did not come from a hostile neighbor or a legal challenge. It came from a sky. The winter, which had been crisp and cold, turned savage. A storm blew in from the north, a blizzard of unprecedented fury that descended upon Blackwood and the surrounding moors like an invading army. For 3 days, the wind howled, a physical, screaming presence that rattled the newly glazed windows and tore at the new slates on the roof. Snow fell in a thick, ceaseless, blinding curtain, burying the world in white. The house, once a drafty sieve, now became their fortress. Alara's practical foresight was thrown into sharp relief. The fires roared, fed by the abundant wood piles. The larder was full. The core of the house was a bastion of warmth and light against the raging chaos outside. They were completely cut off, an island in a sea of white, but they were safe. Or so it seemed. On the second night of the storm, Alara collapsed. It happened without warning. She had been standing by the fire in the main hall, discussing with Finch the need to check on the livestock in the nearest barn. She had seemed tired, her face pale in the firelight, but no more so than usual. Then she swayed, her hand flying to her head. Her eyes rolled back, and she crumpled to the floor in a heap of dark wool. Alistair was across the room in an instant. He reached her first, dropping to his knees beside her. Finch was right behind him. Alistair gathered her into his arms. She was terrifyingly limp, her head lolling against his shoulder. Her skin was on fire. A terrible, raging fever burned through her clothes, a stark contrast to the dead weight of her unconscious body. "Get her to her bed," Finch said, his voice tight with alarm. "I'll fetch Mrs. Gable." Alistair lifted her as if she weighed nothing. He carried her up the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that shocked him. The fear was a cold, sharp thing in his gut. He had wished for her death, clinically and distantly. He had never imagined what the reality of it would feel like. It felt like this burning, fragile weight in his arms, the scent of her, a mix of wool and rosemary and ink, filling his senses. They laid her in her bed, in the small, warm room she had chosen above the kitchen's. Mrs. Gable arrived, her usual stern composure shattered, her face a mask of fear. "It's the lung fever," she whispered, her hand on Alara's forehead. "It's come back on her." She worked herself into the ground. "I told her." For 3 days the storm raged outside, and a different, more terrible storm raged within the small room. Alara was lost to them, trapped in the delirium of a ferocious fever. She tossed and turned, muttering incomprehensible things, fragments of numbers from the ledgers, names of tenants, pleas to a father long dead. Her breathing was a terrible, shallow, rasping sound, a desperate fight for every ounce of air. The local doctor was an impossibility, miles away across impassable snowdrifts. They were alone. And in that crucible of fear and isolation, Alistair's world narrowed to the four walls of that room. The hollow man who had fled London vanished. The resentful Duke, displaced in his own home, ceased to exist. All that was left was a man, stripped of title and pride, fighting a desperate, terrifying battle against the encroaching shadows. He became her unwilling, clumsy, devoted nurse. Mrs. Gable and Finch were there, of course, but Alistair did not leave. He sat in a hardback chair by her bed, the great, powerful Duke of Blackwood, and did the things that needed to be done. He bathed her face and neck with cool water, trying to quell the fire that consumed her. He held her down when the fever dreams made her thrash. He listened to the agonizing sound of her breathing, each rasp a physical blow. Mrs. Gable would bring broth, and it was he who would lift Alara's head, cradling it in the crook of his arm, and patiently, insistently, force the life-giving liquid between her cracked lips. Most of it would spill, but some of it would go down, and he would feel a surge of desperate, pathetic triumph. He kept the fire in her small hearth roaring, feeding it logs with his own hands, his ducal signet ring glinting in the firelight as he worked this simple, primitive task. He was protecting the flame of the fire and the flame of her life. In the long, silent hours of the night, when the wind howled its loudest, he would simply watch her. He saw the faint lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes, even in her unconsciousness. He looked at her hands, lying limp on the coverlet. They were not the soft, useless hands of a lady. They were chapped, the nails cut short and practical. There were calluses on her palms and a faded scratch across her knuckles. These were the hands that had resurrected his home. The hands that had signed contracts, planted a garden, polished his furniture, held a pen, and tallied his accounts. The hands that had fought for every inch of this new world. He felt a wave of something that felt dangerously like shame. He had given her a ruin and commanded her to die in it. He had treated her as less than human, a problem to be disposed of. And she had responded not with malice or despair, but with relentless, breathtaking competence. She had built a home, a sanctuary, and had worn herself to the brink of death doing it. On the third night, the fever reached its crisis. Her breathing became so shallow he could barely detect it. Her skin, once burning, grew cold and clammy. Mrs. Gable stood at the foot of the bed, her hands clasped, tears streaming down her stern face. Finch stood in the doorway, his weathered face gray with dread. They thought they were losing her. Alistair felt a cold, primal terror seize him. He could not let her go. He would not. He sat on the edge of the bed, gathered her into his arms, blankets and all, and held her against his chest, as if he could force his own strength, his own warmth, into her failing body. "You will not do this, Alara," he heard himself whisper, his voice raw, unrecognizable. "You will not die. I forbid it." He held her for hours, rocking her gently, murmuring to her, the sound of his own voice a low, steady anchor in the terrifying quiet. He held on as the storm outside finally began to exhaust itself, as the wind scream softened to a mournful sigh. He held on as the first, pale, gray light of dawn crept into the room. And then he felt it, a slight, shuddering breath, a deeper inhalation. Her body, which had been so terrifyingly still, stirred in his arms. He looked down. Her eyes were open. They were cloudy with exhaustion, but they were lucid. They were focused on his face. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression one of profound confusion. "Your Grace?" she whispered, her voice a mere thread of sound. "What are you doing?" Relief, so potent it was dizzying, washed through him. He gently laid her back against the pillows, his hands trembling. "You were ill," he said, his own voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. She looked around the room, at the concerned faces of Mrs. Gable and Finch, at the chair pulled up beside her bed, at the rumpled state of his clothes. Understanding dawned in her eyes. She had been cared for. She had been saved. And this cold, remote man, her husband, had been at the heart of it. Her gaze returned to his face, searching. She saw the exhaustion there, the dark circles under his eyes, the genuine, unguarded relief. She saw the ghost of the fear he had felt for her. The storm had broken, outside and in. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, a new, fragile peace settled over Blackwood Manor. The snow lay in thick, pristine drifts, muffling the world in silence. The sky was a high, brilliant, cloudless blue. Inside the house, the atmosphere had shifted. The undeclared war was over, replaced by an unspoken truce. Elara recovered slowly, her strength returning in small, incremental measures. The fever was gone, but it had left her weak, the deep reserves of energy she had relied upon for months utterly depleted. She spent her days propped up on pillows, first in her bed, and then in a comfortable armchair that Alistair had ordered moved into her room, positioning it by the window so she could watch the stark, beautiful winter landscape. He was a constant, quiet presence. The desperate, raw caregiver of the crisis had retreated, replaced by a man who was awkward, watchful, and hesitant. He had crossed a line during her illness, had shown a desperate, protective side of himself, and now he seemed unsure how to step back. He would bring her a tray of tea, setting it down with a careful precision that was at odds with his large frame, his movements stiff and unpracticed. It was the gesture of a man unaccustomed to performing small acts of care for anyone. "Mrs. Gable said you should drink this," he would say, his voice flat, avoiding her eyes. "Thank you," she would reply, her own voice quiet. And they would sit in a silence that was no longer a weapon, but a space filled with the heavy, unspoken things that had passed between them. It was not yet comfortable, but it was no longer hostile. One afternoon, about a week after the fever had broken, he found her not in her room, but in the library. She was wrapped in a thick shawl, sitting at the great desk, but the ledgers were closed. She was simply staring into the fire, her expression thoughtful and weary. He hesitated in the doorway, and she looked up. "Don't lurk, Your Grace," she said, a faint echo of her old, sharp tone returning. "It's unsettling." He came into the room and stood by the hearth, warming his hands. The silence stretched for a moment. Then he spoke, his gaze fixed on the flames. The accounts for the quarry came in from town. Finch brought them. He gestured to a small stack of papers on the mantelpiece. "They are a mess." It was a confession of a sort, a confession of his own past neglect, an acknowledgement of the chaos she had been sorting through. He was not blaming her. He was stating a fact they both knew. She sighed, a soft, weary sound. "I know. I haven't been able to make sense of the transport tariffs. I suspect the steward was skimming from them for years." She paused, then made her own confession. "I thought the winter would take me. Before I could fix it." Her voice was soft, matter of fact, but it held the deep, resonant truth of her fear. He turned from a fire to look at her. He saw not the formidable commander or the sickly victim, but the woman who sat between those two extremes. Resilient, but not unbreakable. Pragmatic, but not without fear. "I sent you here to be forgotten," he said, the words costing him. It was not an apology. It was a statement of truth, a necessary laying of the foundation for whatever was to come next. It was an act of profound, calculated cruelty. "I was a fool." She held his gaze, her clear gray eyes searching his. She did not offer absolution. She did not rage at him. She simply nodded, a small, sharp movement of her head. It was an acknowledgement. The truth had been spoken. Now they could move on. "Well," she said, her voice regaining a bit of its practical crispness, "the fool's wife has nearly bankrupted him by purchasing roof tiles and bacon. I suppose we are even." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she had ever seen. It transformed his harsh, severe face, making him look younger, less burdened. "Hardly," he said. That conversation was a turning point. They began to function as a team, a partnership forged in crisis and cemented by a mutual, grudging respect. He would bring the quarry accounts to her desk, and they would work together, their heads bent over the spidery columns of numbers. He, with his formal education and understanding of law, could decipher the legal jargon of old contracts. She, with her hard-won practical knowledge and intuitive grasp of finance, could see the story behind the figures, the places where money had vanished, the opportunities that had been missed. They worked in the quiet, fire-lit library, the only sounds the scratch of a pen, the rustle of paper, and the soft crackle of the fire. The silence between them became easy, companionable. He discovered she had a dry, cynical wit that emerged when she was focused on a problem. She discovered that beneath his cold, aristocratic shell was a mind that was sharp, logical, and, when applied to a practical task, surprisingly helpful. One evening, as she was reaching for a ledger on a high shelf, she swayed, a wave of dizziness from her lingering weakness washing over her. She put out a hand to steady herself, and it landed on his forearm. His muscles tensed beneath her palm, hard as oak. For a moment, they both froze. It was the first time they had touched outside the desperate context of her illness. Her hand was on his arm. It was not a romantic gesture. It was a moment of simple, physical reality. She was a woman who needed balance. He was a man who was solid, a fixed point in the room. He did not pull away. She did not snatch her hand back. After a beat, she steadied herself, and her hand fell away. But something had shifted. The space between them now held a new awareness, a physical charge that had not been there before. He was not just a mind, and she was not just a manager. They were a man and a woman, alone in a quiet house, in the deep heart of winter. The call of the old world arrived on a day when the first signs of a thaw had appeared. Water dripped from the eaves, and the brilliant white of the snow had begun to recede, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath. It came in the form of a royal courier, a man in the king's livery, his horse steaming with effort, having fought its way through the last of the snow-clogged roads. He carried an urgent dispatch, sealed with the imposing wax of a high government office. Alara saw the courier arrive from the library window. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over her. She felt the warmth and fragile peace of the past few weeks evaporate like mist. The world, which had shrunk to the boundaries of Blackwood Manor, was rushing back in. London was calling. Politics was calling. The life that had broken him and sent him fleeing north was reasserting its claim. By the time Alistair came into the library, the dispatch in his hand, her defenses were fully raised. She had retreated behind the cool, formal mask of the Duchess. She stood by the window, her back to him, her posture rigid. The partnership they had built, the comfortable silences, the shared work, it all felt like a temporary illusion, an interlude between acts of his real life. Now, the interlude was over. "You have a summons," she said. It was not a question. "I do," he confirmed, his voice quiet. He stood in the center of the room, the broken seal of the dispatch dangling from his fingers. She turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral, her gray eyes opaque. "When do you leave?" "I will have Mrs. Gable pack your things and prepare provisions for the journey." Her voice was crisp, efficient, the voice of the capable chatelaine he had first discovered. She was already managing his departure, pushing him away with her competence, protecting herself from the abandonment she was certain was coming. He looked at her, at the formidable walls she had thrown up around herself in an instant. He saw the flicker of old pain in her eyes, the expectation of being left behind once more. He looked down at the parchment in his hand. It was a plea, a demand from his political allies. A crisis was brewing at court. They needed his influence, his name, his ruthless strategic mind. They needed the Duke of Blackwood. A month ago, he would have gone without a second thought. Duty was the iron spine of his existence. It was what he had in place of his soul. But as he stood there in a warm, book-lined room that smelled of beeswax and old paper, he felt the pull of that old life, and it was a cold, dead weight. He looked at the fire burning in the hearth, the fire he had watched her build from the ashes of his neglect. He looked at her, this infuriating, resilient, magnificent woman who had met his cruelty with competence and his despair with a quiet, unyielding strength. He had come to Blackwood seeking a grave. He had found a home. Slowly, deliberately, he walked to the fireplace. He did not look at Alara, but he could feel her watching him, her breath held. He held the dispatch over the flames. He saw the spidery, urgent script, the names of powerful men, the fate of political fortunes. It was the world he had been born to. It was the world that had hollowed him out. He let it go. The parchment curled, blackened, and was consumed by the fire, the urgent words turning to gray ash and smoke. Alara let out a small, sharp gasp. She stared at the fireplace, then at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. He turned to face her fully. "I am not leaving," he said, his voice low and resonant with a certainty that shook the very air in the room. "My duty is no longer to a crown that uses men like pawns or to a government of serpents." It left me empty. He took a step toward her, then another, closing the distance between them until he was standing directly before her. He could see the confusion and a wild, burgeoning hope warring in her eyes. "For my entire life," he said, his voice softer now, more raw, "I have served titles and land and the memory of my ancestors. I have lived in palaces and townhouses and army tents. I have never had a home." He reached out, not to her arm to steady her, but to cup her face in his hand. His palm was warm against her skin. It was a gesture of profound, unpracticed tenderness. "This," he said, his thumb stroking her cheek, "this house you have breathed life into, this quiet, this warmth, this partnership. You." He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw the truth of his words reflected there, stark and undeniable. "You are my home, Alara." Her name on his lips was an intimacy more profound than any kiss. The wall she had so carefully constructed, the defenses she had spent a lifetime building, did not just crumble. They dissolved into nothing. A single tear, hot and cleansing, escaped her eye and traced a path through the faint streak of dirt that was still on her cheek. She did not brush it away. For the first time, she allowed her vulnerability to be seen. She allowed herself to be weak in his presence, knowing, finally, that she was safe. She leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was a total surrender. It was an acceptance. He gathered her into his arms, and she went willingly, her head finding its place against his chest. She wrapped her own arms around his waist, holding on to the solid, steady reality of him. He was no longer a ghost in her house, and she was no longer a problem to be solved. They were a permanent fixture, two survivors who had found their fortress. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the firelit library, the ashes of his old life cooling in the grate. Outside, the last of the winter snow was melting, and the promise of spring was a secret whispered by the damp, waking earth. The house around them was silent, but it was a living silence, the quiet hum of a place that was fiercely alive and, at long last, completely whole.